Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise on today's really complex issues, basically giving you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
That's the plan.
And today, we are plunging deep into the Ukraine conflict. It's reshaped so much of our world lately.
It really has. And we're not just skimming the headlines.
No, definitely not.
This deep dive, it's based on a pretty detailed sociological analysis by Dr. Mahmood Delkhasteh. And it offers, a critical look at the conflict's origins.
Critical how?
It draws parallels to other interventions, and it really challenges that standard unprovoked narrative you hear everywhere.
Okay.
So our mission today is to uncover some of these layers, the ones often overlooked, and give you a more multifaceted understanding.
And let's be crystal clear right from the get-go.
All right.
Our goal here is to impartially convey the ideas, the evidence presented in this specific source.
Exactly. We're not taking sides.
No endorsements here. We just want to help you, our listener, understand the different arguments, the different historical contexts that are out there, maybe beyond the usual reporting.
So let's get into it.
Let's unpack it. Where does this analysis really start?
It kicks off by digging into the historical context. It suggests the groundwork for this conflict was laid, way before 2022.
Okay, so long before the invasion itself.
Right. It points to big geopolitical shifts and what it calls a pattern of unfulfilled promises.
Unfulfilled promises.
Like what?
Well, the first big one the source highlights is about NATO expansion.
Ah, okay. That comes up a lot.
It does. And specifically, it brings up the not 1-inch promise.
Yep.
This was supposedly made to Mikhail Gorbachev back in 1990.
By whom?
By top Western leaders, James Baker, for instance, U.S. Secretary of State at the time. This was all during talks about German reunification.
And the promise was?
That if the Soviet Red Army pulled out of East Germany, NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase.
And the source argues this was a key promise. Yes, it really digs into the records from February 1990, arguing this pledge was absolutely central to Gorbachev agreeing to reunification. But according to this analysis, that promise was broken pretty quickly.
Were there warnings about this?
Oh, yeah. The source points to people like George F. Kennan, the famous U.S. diplomat. Back in 1997, he called NATO expansion, and I quote, the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era.
Wow. He predicted problems.
He predicted a backlash, anti-Western nationalism in Russia. The core idea here, from the source's perspective, is that the conflict's roots might be in this long pattern, decades long, where Russia's security concerns were, voiced, but then, according to this analysis, just dismissed.
And creating distrust.
Dangerous cycle of it, yeah.
Okay, so that's the NATO expansion angle. What else does the analysis point to?
Well, it really zooms in on the 2008 Bucharest summit. This is where NATO officially declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members.
That sounds like a pretty significant statement.
It was huge. And the analysis highlights that there was actually strong opposition within NATO, especially from European leaders. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, apparently said Putin would see it as, quote, a declaration of war.
And Putin had warned about this before.
Yes. The source notes he'd already warned about trust eroding if Ukraine joined NATO. So this 2008 declaration, from this perspective, was a major escalation point.
So it sounds like the source is building this case that external pressures like NATO expansion were really ramping things up over time.
That's the core argument, yes. A long-standing tension where Western expansion, or perceived expansion, kept bumping up against Russia's stated security needs that the analysis argues were ignored for years.
Okay, so if that's the external side, how does Dr. Delkhasteh's analysis look at Ukraine's internal situation? How did that become part of this flashpoint?
Well, it goes back to Ukraine's independence in 1991. The source notes that its 1996 constitution actually enshrined neutrality as a guiding principle.
Neutrality, like Switzerland or Austria.
Exactly like Austria. That was the model. The source says there were two main reasons. One, they saw what happened to Georgia defeated by Russia, even with some U.S. backing.
Right.
And two, they wanted to copy Austria's successful post-WWII neutrality. The whole point was to avoid becoming a battleground between East and West.
A buffer zone, essentially.
Precisely. But the analysis argues this neutrality principle became, quote, the first victim in this geopolitical tug of war between Russia and the U.S. NATO.
How so? What changed?
The analysis points to growing external influence, especially after the 2004 Orange Revolution.
Okay.
And it quotes Victoria Nuland, who later became quite prominent, stating openly in 2013 that the U.S. had spent over $5 billion to support democratic development in Ukraine, mostly through NGOs.
$5 billion. That's a lot of influence.
It's significant funding. And this, the source argues, leads directly to the events of 2014, Maidan.
The overthrow of President Yanukovych.
The democratically elected President Yanukovych, yes. And the source highlights a really striking detail here, a leaked phone call. Another one.
Yes. Between Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador at the time, Jeffrey Piat, this was just 2 weeks before Yanukovych was ousted.
And what did they discuss?
They were literally discussing who should lead the new government. They named Arseniy Yatsenyuk. And they even talked about his relationship with neo-Nazi elements.
And Yatsenyuk did end up leading the interim government.
Exactly as discussed in the call. The analysis presents this as pretty damning evidence of direct U.S. involvement in shaping the post-Yanukovych government.
Wow. Okay. And the source goes further on Maidan itself.
It does. It talks about the Maidan massacre, the shootings, and it presents evidence, including testimonies and another leaked phone call.
Goodness. Who was on this one?
This one was reportedly between the Estonian foreign minister and Catherine Ashton, who was the EU's foreign policy chief.
And the content?
The source claims this evidence suggests the massacre was actually a false flag operation.
Meaning a covert act designed to look like it was done by someone else. In this case, the source argues it was carried out by elements within the opposition, not the police, specifically to destabilize the country and blame Yanukovych's forces.
That is a very strong claim.
A false flag.
It's a powerful accusation,
Yeah.
yeah. And the source uses this to challenge the standard narrative of Maidan. It even cites figures like George Friedman from the intelligence platform Stratfor, who apparently called it the most blatant coup in history, orchestrated through these civil society groups, funded partly by that money we mentioned.
So the source paints 2014 not just as a popular uprising, but as something heavily influenced, even directed from outside.
That's the argument it puts forward, yes. A strategically influenced change, rather than just a straightforward democratic revolution.
Okay, given all that, the internal shifts, the alleged external influence, let's talk about the diplomatic efforts that followed, the Minsk agreements.
Right. Minsk first in 2014 and Minsk the second in 2015. These came about because of the conflict that erupted in the Donbas region right after Maidan. And what were they supposed to do?
Well, the source explains they were endorsed by the UN Security Council. The aim was to protect the cultural rights of people in Donbas, many of whom are Russian speakers, their language, their culture, and critically, to replace the fighting with dialogue, a path to peace.
Sounds reasonable on paper.
It does, but, oh boy, the source presents a pretty explosive claim here.
Such as?
It argues the agreements were essentially a trick.
A trick? By whom?
It points to admissions made later by key European leaders. Angela Merkel again, Francois Hollande of France, and even the Ukrainian president at the time, Petro Poroshenko.
What did they admit?
According to the source, they basically said that Minsk was just a way to buy time. Time for Ukraine to rearm, to strengthen its military with Western help, rather than a genuine attempt at peace.
So, deception.
That's the implication. The source even mentions Zelensky later admitting to Macron and Merkel that delaying diplomacy is completely fine.
Wow. If true, that completely changes the picture of those agreements.
It really does. The source argues these admissions show a deliberate strategy. Deceive Russia, deceive the people in Donbas, while NATO covertly helped rebuild Ukraine's army. It suggests a long-term strategic game was being played, not a real peace process.
This really feeds into that core tension you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The unprovoked versus provoked narrative.
Exactly, because the dominant Western line, voiced strongly by President Biden, is that Russia's 2022 invasion was completely unjustified and unprovoked.
But this analysis flips that on its head.
Starkly. It argues the invasion was a provoked response, provoked by years of consistent Western actions.
Like what specifically, beyond the expansion itself?
It lists several things. The continued eastward march of NATO, despite those earlier alleged promises. Then there are U.S. military training programs. The source specifically mentions the CIA covertly training elite Ukrainian forces starting way back in 2015.
Covert training.
And also the setup of what it calls secret intelligence centers right on Russia's border, starting, it claims, a full decade before the 2022 invasion.
Okay, so a pattern of military and intelligence buildup. What about diplomacy just before the invasion?
The source reminds us about December 2021. Russia put forward these draft treaty agreements.
Right, I remember hearing about those. What did they ask for?
Explicit demands that NATO must commit to no further eastward expansion and no NATO military bases in Ukraine, essentially codifying Ukrainian neutrality and creating security buffers.
And how did the West respond?
According to the source, President Biden rejected them outright, famously saying, "I accept no one's red lines."
So a flat no.
Pretty much. And this refusal, in the context of the analysis, is presented as another key piece of the provoked argument.
Does the source cite anyone else supporting this provoked idea?
It does. It mentions Pope Francis, who suggested the conflict was, quote, perhaps somehow provoked by NATO barking at Russia's gates. And interestingly, even a well-known neoconservative thinker, Robert Kagan, admitted that insisting the invasion was completely unprovoked is misleading.
Even Kagan said that. Interesting. It does make you wonder if a different diplomatic path was possible then.
That's the question the analysis implicitly raises.
Stepping back a bit, if it wasn't just about Ukraine joining NATO, what does the source argue was the bigger goal here?
It argues the conflict essentially serves as a U.S. proxy war.
Proxy war, meaning the U.S. is using Ukraine to fight Russia indirectly.
That's the argument. And the primary objective, according to this analysis, is, quote, weakening Russia.
Is there evidence presented for that being the goal?
It quotes prominent figures like former Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin saying they wanted to see Russia weakened, Senator Marco Rubio saying similar things, and it references a 2019 report from the RAND Corporation, a major U.S. think tank, that actually detailed strategies to, quote, overextend and unbalance Russia.
Wow, a RAND report outlining how to do it.
Detailing strategies, yes. And the source includes a very blunt assessment from Chas Freeman, a veteran U.S. diplomat who described the U.S. strategy as, America will fight Russia to the last Ukrainian.
Oof, that's stark.
It is. It suggests a strategic motive that goes way beyond just defending Ukraine's sovereignty, aiming for broader geopolitical wins by using Ukraine as the battlefield.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to the economic side of things. The sanctions. That was a huge part of the Western response.
Massive. Unprecedented, really. The source notes over 16,500 individual sanctions were imposed on Russia.
And the expectation was?
Leaders like President Biden, Kaja Kallas of Estonia, they publicly predicted these sanctions would break the back of the Russian economy, cripple it.
But that's not quite what happened, according to this source.
No, and this is one of the really striking points the analysis makes. It highlights the, well, unexpected resilience of the Russian economy.
Resilience how?
Despite everything under what the source calls skillful management, Russia's economy has actually thrived in some ways. It became the world's fourth largest economy when measured by purchasing power parity PPP.
Fourth largest. Ahead of who?
Ahead of Germany and Japan, according to the PPP metric cited, which is remarkable given the pressure.
And what about Europe's economy during this?
Well, that's the stark contrast the source draws. Europe, which fully participated in the sanctions, has largely experienced economic recession. So the sanctions had, perhaps, unintended consequences, or at least consequences that hit Europe harder than expected.
And then there was the Nord Stream pipeline incident.
Yeah.
That felt like a major escalation.
Huge. The sabotage in September 2022. Multiple underwater explosions.
What does the source say about who was responsible?
It heavily features the investigation by Seymour Hersh, the veteran investigative journalist.
Hersh's reporting pointed the finger where?
Directly at the U.S. on orders from President Biden himself. Hersh laid out a detailed account of how it was allegedly done.
And Biden had previously threatened Nord Stream 2, hadn't he?
Publicly, yes. He said back in February 2022, if Russia invaded, there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
So Hersh's reporting aligns with that threat. How did Europe react to the sabotage of its major energy infrastructure?
That's another critical point in the analysis. It highlights what it sees as very muted, almost passive European reactions.
For example?
It mentions the infamous tweet from Poland's former foreign minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, that just said, "Thank you, USA." He later deleted it, but it was out there.
Wow.
And then it points to the official investigations by Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. The source describes them as incredibly slow, inconclusive, suggesting perhaps a reluctance to find an inconvenient culprit, maybe even a cover-up.
It really raises questions about Europe's position, its agency in all this.
Absolutely. Which leads directly into this rather provocative concept the source introduces, the idea of a kakistocracy in Western leadership.
Kakistocracy, what does that mean?
It means, basically, government by the worst, least qualified, or most unscrupulous citizens.
Okay, and the source applies this to current Western leaders.
Right. It does. It references Henry Kissinger's 2022 book on leadership, where Kissinger apparently lamented that contemporary Western leaders lack intellectual seriousness and clear strategic goals, and that this is contributing to Europe's decline.
So a critique of leadership quality.
Yes, but the source takes it a step further. It suggests there might be a kind of psychology of subjugation at play in Europe.
Psychology of subjugation, meaning?
Meaning European leaders seem to prioritize U.S. interests, U.S. strategic goals, even when they might conflict with their own nation's well-being. Germany's relative silence over the Nord Stream sabotage, which directly harmed its economy, is presented as a prime example of this perceived subservience.
That's a very pointed critique of European leadership.
It's definitely one of the more provocative arguments in the analysis.
Okay, let's pivot now to something crucial and often, I think, simplified. Ukrainian identity itself, the rise of nationalism there, and the role of President Zelensky.
Right. The source emphasizes that Ukraine is historically a nation with a really diverse identity. You have Ukrainian speakers, Russian speakers, significant regional differences. Forging a single unified national identity has always been, well, challenging.
So how did nationalism fit into this, according to the analysis?
It argues that, particularly in recent decades, Ukrainian national identity increasingly defined itself in opposition to Russia as not Russia.
Oh, we?
And this, the source contends, fueled the rise of more extreme nationalist ideologies.
How did that manifest?
One example it gives is the glorification of controversial historical figures like Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukovich.
Who were they?
They were World War II-era Ukrainian nationalist leaders, but they also collaborated with Nazi Germany at times, and their movements were implicated in massacres of Jews and Poles, so deeply controversial figures.
And the source says they were being glorified.
Yes, statues erected, streets named after them, which leads to what the analysis calls a paradox concerning President Zelensky himself.
Because of his background.
Exactly. Zelensky is Jewish. Yet the source points out his government provided funding for Bandera statues, and he publicly praised Bandera as a defender of Ukraine's freedom. It's presented as a complex, perhaps contradictory position.
What about contemporary groups?
The analysis highlights the significant role of neo-Nazi groups like the Svoboda Party and the Azov Battalion within Ukrainian politics, and especially its military, particularly after 2014.
That's something that's been reported elsewhere, too, the Azov controversy.
It has, and the source goes further, alleging a kind of cultural genocide against Russian language and culture within Ukraine, banning Russian books, music, the Orthodox Church linked to Moscow, even changing the date of Christmas from the traditional Orthodox January 7th.
Were Western institutions aware of these nationalist elements?
The source says yes. It notes the European Parliament itself labeled Svoboda as racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic back in 2012. And it quotes Foreign Policy magazine observing that a significant portion of the post-Maidan Kyiv government were actually fascists.
But these aspects were often downplayed in the West.
The analysis argues they were acknowledged, but then largely ignored or minimized by Western powers supporting Kyiv, adding another layer of complexity.
So where does Zelensky fit into this picture personally? How did he navigate this? He wasn't initially seen as a hardline nationalist, was he?
Not at all, and this is crucial. The source emphasizes he was elected in 2019 with a massive landslide, 73% of the vote.
On what platform?
Explicitly promising peace with Russia and pledging to implement the Minsk agreements we talked about earlier. That was his mandate.
So, a peace mandate. What happened?
Well, the analysis details how he came under intense pressure almost immediately. Pressure from Ukrainian ultranationalists and neo-Nazi groups.
Pressure how?
It mentions figures like Dmytro Yarosh, founder of a major neo-Nazi paramilitary group, essentially warning Zelensky not to pursue peace. The source even alleges there were explicit threats of assassination if he tried to make a deal with Putin based on Minsk.
Threats against his life.
That's what the source claims. Along with pressure from Western backers who, as we discussed, may not have wanted the Minsk process to succeed anyway.
So he was caught between his mandate and these powerful forces.
Exactly. And the source describes him making a dramatic 180-degree turn, abandoning the peace platform, embracing the more hardline nationalist agenda.
Contrasting his image with the reality on the ground.
Yes. It contrasts his very effective public media persona as a wartime leader with the immense human cost of the conflict for ordinary Ukrainians forced conscription, staggering casualties.
And the source suggests a motive for this U-turn.
It raises the possibility of self-preservation, drawing a parallel, actually, to Benjamin Netanyahu extending conflicts, potentially, to stay in power and avoid accountability for other issues, like corruption. It's presented as a possible lens for understanding Zelensky's choices.
That's quite the parallel to draw. Okay, this brings us to another key part of the analysis. The idea of missed opportunities for peace, specifically after the 2022 invasion began.
Right. The source argues there were at least 3 significant attempts at negotiation early in the war, but claims they were all effectively sabotaged by Western intervention.
3 attempts. What were they?
The first was very early, in March 2022. Zelensky himself publicly stated Ukraine was willing to discuss neutrality, security guarantees, even potentially rejecting NATO membership altogether.
This was after the invasion started.
Yes, and the source argues that if this kind of offer had been seriously pursued before the invasion, it just might have prevented it.
Okay, what was the second attempt?
Later in March 2022, there were talks held in Istanbul, mediated by Turkish President Erdogan.
What happened there?
Apparently, they made real progress. The source says Ukraine tentatively agreed to permanent neutrality, formally renouncing NATO ambitions, in exchange for security guarantees from various countries.
A potential deal?
It seemed like it. And Russia, supposedly as a goodwill gesture, actually pulled its forces back from the areas around Kyiv.
So why didn't that deal happen? What went wrong?
This is where the source's claim about Western sabotage comes in most strongly. It cites multiple sources, including one of the Ukrainian negotiators, David Urkamia, and former U.S. official Fiona Hill.
And what do they claim happened?
They claim that the UK Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, flew to Kyiv.
Okay.
And he allegedly relayed a message, essentially from the Biden administration, telling Zelensky that Putin couldn't be trusted, that the West was not ready for peace, and that Ukraine should essentially walk away from the deal and just fight.
You told him to keep fighting.
Yes, promising full NATO backing, weapons, money, basically saying, we'll help you defeat Russia, don't make a deal now.
Wow. If that's accurate, it means a potential peace deal was scuttled.
That's precisely the argument the source makes, that Western powers, particularly the US and UK, actively intervened to prevent an early peace settlement.
Why would they do that, according to this analysis?
Well, it ties back to that proxy war goal. The analysis argues the objective wasn't just peace for Ukraine, but achieving the broader strategic aims we discussed.
Weakening Russia.
And potentially even regime change in Moscow. The source quotes figures like Hillary Clinton and retired General Keith Kellogg, framing the war explicitly as a way to end the Putin regime and also send a powerful message to China.
So, bigger geopolitical stakes were prioritized over a quicker end to the fighting.
That's the conclusion the analysis draws. And it underscores the devastating human cost of that choice, particularly for Ukraine, the continued population decline, the horrific casualties, the ongoing destruction, all part of a conflict that, according to this source's account, might have been avoided or at least significantly shortened.
It really makes you think about who benefits from a prolonged conflict versus who pays the price.
It certainly does.
Okay, let's try and unpack all of this then. What emerges from diving into this specific analysis by Dr. Delkhasteh is, well, it's a complex picture, isn't it?
Definitely not simple. It's this tapestry woven with, historical grievances going way back, these alleged strategic deceptions like the Minsk trick, significant claims of external interference. It offers a radically different lens on the whole conflict.
Yeah, we've covered a lot. The claims of broken NATO promises, the arguments about U.S. influence in Ukraine's internal politics, especially around 2014.
The controversial take on the Minsk agreements not being genuine, and of course, the core argument that the invasion was arguably provoked by a pattern of Western actions, challenging that dominant narrative.
Right, and then the internal complexities, Ukrainian identity, the documented rise of extreme nationalism, Zelensky's really difficult choices, or maybe his U-turn, as the source puts it.
Plus, those critiques of Western leadership, the kakistocracy idea, the psychology of subjugation in Europe, the questions around the Nord Stream sabotage, and the unexpected economic outcomes of the sanctions war.
And finally, those alleged missed opportunities for peace, potentially sabotaged by external actors aiming for broader goals like weakening Russia or regime change.
It's a dense analysis, packed with claims and evidence presented from a very specific, critical perspective.
So what does all this really mean for you, listening to this?
Well, I think the main takeaway from exploring this particular analysis is just how many layers and interpretations there can be to huge global events like this. It pushes you way beyond the often simplified headlines.
It challenges you to look deeper.
Exactly. To look past those easy narratives and consider this intricate web of history, geopolitics, internal dynamics, all these factors that are usually at play. This kind of, deeper dive into a specific viewpoint, even a challenging one, is pretty crucial for getting a real handle on complex international situations.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you to mull over. In this age where we're just bombarded with information, how might consciously seeking out diverse perspectives, especially the ones that maybe challenge what you already believe, how might that equip you better?
How might it help you navigate the complexities not just of this conflict, but future global events?
Then maybe help you discern those deeper narratives, the stories beneath the surface stories. Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.